I'm not going to say a great deal about Boston in 1974. Along with the video, I'm hoping that other comrades who were veterans of that tremendous struggle will fill in. I'll say this much. At the time of the march, living in New York as I have most of my life, even though I was born right here in Boston, in Roxbury, I was a 22-year-old ex-GI during the Vietnam War. For about a year and a half, I had been a member of Workers' World Party, which supported me and other soldiers who were struggling against the war. And the thing about the march that was so incredible to me personally is that it just demonstrated how powerful a revolutionary can be, especially if they're in an organization with other revolutionaries, when there is a crisis. And that's an important experience for a young revolutionary. It's one of the markers, that influences their revolutionary path for the remainder of their life. As you could see from the video, this was a very racist, fascistic, dangerous situation. People in more recent years who recall Ferguson and all the other places where black and brown people have been slaughtered by police, and how there are not only local mobilizations and national mobilizations. But back in '74, Boston was the center of the anti-racist struggle. Barring no region, including the South. It was an experience in this city like they hadn't seen. These mobs of white thugs attacking children on buses, beating them up, throwing rocks at them, attacking people on the street. It was quite something. And my recollection is that the movement was a lot of people, progressive anti-racist people, but somehow the movement was paralyzed. And so we decided, at the invitation and urging of our comrades here in Boston, Comrade Steve was just reminding me how y'all came down and said, you gotta do this. We can't do this by ourselves. We decided, hey, listen, we're going to intervene and we're going to have a national march. We were a small party, didn't have that many members, that many branches, but this had to be done. And so we said, let's do it. The state was against us. Most of the politicians were against us. We don't want a national coming here. We don't want outsiders coming here. All that stuff. But we did this, and it changed the party in an incredible, historic, meaningful way. Obviously, it's not only an important chapter for the Boston branch of the party. It was a transformative chapter. You could go on and talk about, the union, the bus drivers union, and how that came out of, the defense of children and so forth. We were coming, no doubt, to the defense of the black community, of black children and black parents, being in solidarity with them. That was one aspect of it, vital aspect of it. Another aspect of it shouldn't be dismissed, and is equally important. We are a workers' party, and we understood historically how racism is used to divide workers, and that intervening in Boston in that period against racism was a way to assert unity for our class. It's important because some people say, well, you want unity, then don't talk too much about racism and, everything will be nice, That doesn't work. That's evading the subject. That's cowardly. Our view has always been to have unity, you confront the racists. And you explain to everybody, including progressive white people, and maybe white people who may not be so progressive, but hopefully, are susceptible to changing, that this is necessary not only for equality and fighting racist oppression here, but if the working class is going to do larger things, ultimately defeat capitalism, we're going to have this unity. So that class message was very, very important to us. I was thinking about the period, it was a few years after the Vietnam War. Actually, officially, it was just 1 year before the official end, but the U.S. had been losing. The Vietnamese had already won. Ho Chi Minh had already won. The war was winding down, and it was the beginning of the first capitalist economic recession in the post-Vietnam era. The war expenditures had sort of artificially pumped up the economy and the stock market, but that was running out. And the inevitable capitalist recession and crisis was beginning in the 70s. And that's a long story in and of itself because, some of you may not remember this, hopefully at least half of you, because, we want to have all generations represented here. That was before Reagan came in, and that was before Thatcher in Britain. They were sort of the two sides of the racist, reactionary, ruling class on both sides of the Atlantic. And the attacks on the working class, deindustrialization, the closing of the auto and steel plants, the busting of unions, austerity, more and more attacks. And I only raise it because while I'm mentioning it, you have to keep in the back of your mind, what is the ruling class's strategy to derail the working class, to divide it, to try to stop it from fighting back? Racism is one of those things, and you can see by Trump, and other things, that strategy is just as potent and just as dangerous, if not more so, because of the world economic crisis and austerity and inequality and all the other things that working people are fighting. And I think that is all I'm going to say about Boston. I want to try in the few minutes left to me to contextualize the lessons of Boston and the importance of unity against racism to today. How many people are aware of the elections that recently took place in Britain? Right, yeah. What was it, Thursday? Yeah, Thursday, December 12th, there were elections throughout what's called the United Kingdom, which means Ireland, which is its own country that's still fighting to get away from, the United Kingdom, and Scotland and so forth. There were elections, and it was the Tories, the Conservative Party, the main bourgeois party, against the Labour Party, which is a complicated party. Some compare it to the Democrats, but the Democrats are somewhat less complicated. Let me not go into an explanation of that. Democrats are clearly a party of the ruling class that pretends to be a party of the masses. And I think the problem in our movement is that some think that the left can change that. We'll see how that all works out. Workers' World Party is not holding its breath on that. Whereas the Labour Party in England has a different history. It is a social democratic party. It is to some extent based on time and who was in the leadership, devoted to representing the interests of workers. But it's also a bourgeois party because the ruling class is in there. And the ruling class is in there most of the time, and most of the time it runs it and determines its policies. And what happened a few years ago with the emergence of Jeremy Corbyn, who is the current leader, I don't think he's going to be that leader for too long, is that the party has been pushed to the left. And it's quite a phenomenon. Some of you may not know much about Jeremy Corbyn. I'm not an expert on it, but I know this much. He's a leftist. I don't consider him a revolutionary in the way that I consider my comrades and workers were, a little more complicated. On the other hand, I think he's to the left of Sanders, especially on things like supporting Palestine and anti-imperialist positions. He became the leader about 3 or 4 years ago, and he brought a lot of young people into the party. Some of the young people who in this country, we remember from Occupy Wall Street, who after the '08 worldwide financial crisis realized that no matter how many degrees they had, no matter how much formal education, the doors were closing to this promise that they could be part of the bourgeoisie or even have a decent living. Now so many of them, they're living on the gig economy. Well, that was happening around the world. And these young people coming into the Labour Party was part of that. The Labour Party suffered a huge defeat on Thursday. And the Conservatives, led by Boris Johnson, who some people compare to Trump. And while it may be not exactly identical, I can understand the comparison. It is analogous on many ways in terms of racism, anti-immigration, and so forth. And the program that's all been mobilized around Boris Johnson, the Conservatives, is this racist Brexit. Do people remember that? That's short for, the UK breaking with the European Union. The European Union is just a bigger multi-country version of any ruling class government. So we're against it. It's terrible, But the interest of the workers, whether they're in a country that's part of the European Union or in a country that's just dealing with its local ruling class, these days is virtually, there's no difference. It's the same ruling class. So, breaking with the EU, we don't have a position on that one way or another. It doesn't, it's not a substitute for the class struggle, and it doesn't help the working class, But the reason for Brexit, and I think even a lot of our friends in Europe and in England don't realize this as sharply as we do. The motive behind Brexit, there may be some in the ruling class who think that once they get out of the European Union, maybe they'll have better trade deals with Trump, I think that will not save, England from the capitalist crisis that's going to get worse very soon all around the world. But the main thing, we would argue, is that Brexit was about racism and blaming the immigrants. Just like Trump's war on immigrants here. It was a blatant, bold attempt to split the working class based on racism. Some of it's generational. Younger workers are more open to immigrants, have a more global internationalist view. Some of the older sections, especially those who have been hit hard by plant closings, by the mines closing, they're more backwards. They have a different culture that comes from a different time. And what the bourgeoisie sells them, it doesn't have, decent things to give them to replace what it's taken away from them. What it sells them is nostalgia for the past. It's sort of like what a lot of white people get in the South. now all over the country, Well, we can't give you a job, we can't give you good wages, we can't give you good health care. As a matter of fact, we're breaking all that stuff down. But we can tell you that we're going to bring back things to the way it was when it seemed like white people had the advantage over everybody else, and men had the advantage over women, and we hated LGBTQ people, and put them in the closet or worse, and if you can't have a dinner or a future for your kids, at least you can be nostalgic about some reactionary past. That's really what Brexit was about. And we can get the black and brown people and the Muslims and the women wearing scarves and stuff like that, we can get them out of the country, This election a few days ago, what happened? Brexit won out. And what Brexit had become, it was initially voted on 3 years ago, summer of 2016, was a substitute for the class struggle. And what we were dealing with was racism winning. I hope our friends and comrades on the other side of the Atlantic understand this, because they've got a big fight ahead of them. The left in the UK, the United Kingdom, I don't like referring to them because that's the old empire, they're down now. They're very down. They're very demoralized. But that will pass. This is one of the bad things that happened, like the election of Trump, and they'll get their act together. And as the capitalist crisis deepens, the working class will find a way to fight itself out of demoralization, out of confusion, and to push aside this racism. The sooner, the better. So I'm concerned, but I'm not worried about the future. We have the same struggle here. How are we gonna do that? But it's important to call something what it is. Corbyn, while I don't view him as revolutionary, I give him a lot of credit. They had a good workers' manifesto that was their election program, had a lot of good things in it that are similar to like Medicaid for all. They have the health service in the UK, which is better than what we have here, although they've been chipping away at it, as well as education and all the things that people really need, But some of the things that they didn't have that I think are critical is this. And I'm not going to give you the lessons of the election more than I have already. Actually, it's a little too early to do that, but I'm giving it for historical context. We're talking about 1974. Now we're almost in 2020. What the Labour Party did was rely on the elections instead of finding a way to get the unions and the workers and the youth out in the streets. It's dangerous when the class struggle, from our vantage point, that is the working class, relies exclusively on elections in a bourgeois country. Why? Because 9 out of 10 times the bourgeoisie is going to prevail, because elections are their thing. They know how to do it. And they're going to find a way to undermine us. And they have the bourgeois media on their side. And one of the biggest things, have some of you followed this? I've had to do that over the last 48 hours just to catch up. But they painted Corbyn as a terrorist and anti-Semite for his support for the Palestinians, for his opposition to endless wars that have destroyed the Middle East. They called him a communist. Generals held a press conference and said that if he were elected, he'd be a danger to the national security of the country. So they were not going to let this guy, become the leader. And they were going to throw as much BS at him and beat him down as hard as they could, because they just weren't going to have it, But the Labour Party could have done some things. Maybe I shouldn't spend too much time on that although I think they're interesting lessons that need to be examined, especially the one about, hey, instead of these elections, what about calling a general strike, to deal with all the grievances that the class has? There haven't been that many strikes compared to the strikes that are taking place even in this country. Actually, 2018 and 2019 has seen an upswing of strikes, local and national strikes, And Corbyn couldn't say, in my view, what he wanted to say because he knows better, and what he needed to say. Why? Because of the complex nature of the Labour Party. In part, it represents the working class, but in part, it's owned by and represents the bourgeoisie. So Corbyn couldn't say, this Brexit stuff is a racist trick to divide the workers. He couldn't say it because that would annoy the bourgeois part of the party. I would have said it if I were him. They might have lost. There may have been nothing they could do to win the election. Who knows? But I think that's probably true. But at least if you're going to lose, you should be strong and tell the workers the truth, because you feel better in loss and you learn something from it. Were I Corbyn, I would have taken a train or a plane to Paris, to go there in solidarity with the general strike in France. Because it would have sent a number of messages. One, the working class has no borders. And whether we're in the European Union or not, we're part of the workers of the world. And so our French comrades are part of our class. Just like our Iraqi comrades, just like our Cuban comrades, just like our comrades from Indonesia, from China, from Asia, from all over the world, regardless of culture or language or geography. They're part of our class. When I was reading about the Comintern, the Third Communist International, founded 100 years ago, I was reading about how Leon Trotsky and Lenin, before he died, were discussing introducing a resolution into the Third International called the Comintern to be in favor of a United States of Europe. Think about it, if that had prevailed, then we would be talking about not just a general strike in France, but maybe a European-wide general strike. And if you can do it based on the EU, or a continent, or a cluster of countries, either in Latinx America, we're getting close to the day, and this will be a great day. And it may be in our lifetimes. I think it will be, if not socialist revolution, one before the other. Global general strikes. I'm trying to, in a brief way, sort of sharpen the lessons for the working class, going forward. Divisions and fragmentation is our biggest problem. When Steve was driving me over here, he was reminding me of what the various left groups were doing in 1974, and how this group didn't even want to fight the racism, and were trying to say that, being against busing was being for the workers, which was a ridiculous, position. And how another group was just trying to derail it into some moderate thing, what we were trying to do. And I couldn't help, when I was listening to the video, imagine if the left could come together. If we can do so much, imagine if we were really united on a global basis, which is not to say that we would not have some differences. And perhaps we'd come to a point that based on differences, it would be like oil and water. On the other hand, how much bigger, how much stronger, how much more successful and awesome the working class movement would be if all of the groups put aside sectarianism,
fragmentation and did what was in the interest of class, especially when it came to defending the oppressed as a way to have workers' unity. The lesson for the young activists, whatever candidate they're for, especially if they're for Sanders, who calls himself a socialist, and that's a complicated thing for another time. The lesson coming out of the UK, don't rely exclusively on the bourgeois elections. Organize the workers, bring them out, be concerned with strikes becoming bigger and bigger and enjoying more real solidarity. Find ways to empower the working class, no matter who wins, which is not to say that we don't have a view about that. But what's more important is our class in motion. You know, every time I hear about Medicare for all, I say, great, that's great. Where's the strike for it? Where's the big demonstration occupying Wall Street overnight demanding Medicare for all? Free college, terrific. Workers' World is for that. Where's the big struggle for it? We're supposed to wait until November and just leave it up to the elections? We're supposed to abandon the street? And who are we abandoning it to? Fascists? And the Ku Klux Klan and Nazis and pro-Trump people? See, this is part of the lesson of what's happening around the world. Finally, the punchline. The ruling class, more and more, certainly more than it was 10 years ago, is splitting. To a large extent, that's what Trump is about. We don't want NATO, we don't want alliances with the French bourgeoisie and the German bourgeoisie, whatever, you know, because they have a crisis that's going to get worse. And so they're trying to figure out some new things to do, you know, and apart from what they've been doing since the end of the Second Imperialist World War, where they had these alliances. When the ruling class is falling apart, it should send a signal to the working class. That means we should come together. If you're worried about fascism and reactionary nationalism, and what I mean by reactionary nationalism is make America great again, as opposed to oppressed people standing up and saying, you know, we want self-determination for the black nation, or for Native people, or for the Latinx nation. It's a difference between reactionary nationalism and revolutionary nationalism. We have to fight nationalism, which the ruling class is going to use more and more as a weapon, with internationalism. Not only ideologically, but somehow we're going to have to do it in a material and practical way. That's hard. I don't know where we start. You know, I wish that our labor movement, the organized labor movement, would call even a press conference, better demonstration, just to say, we support the French general strike. And our concerns about the working class don't end at the boundaries of this country. Or if there's a general strike in India, or if Mexican workers are on strike, or if workers anywhere are on strike, that somebody that's associated with the working class, especially in a leadership position, says, I have a position, and it's important, you know? Maybe more of that will happen, but it won't happen unless we light a fire under these people. You know, we've got to fight bourgeois nationalism with internationalism. And starting now, I think we've all got to put our head together in preparation for what's coming. And think about how we can do that. Most likely, it'll be easier to bring about concrete ideas and demonstrations of internationalism. That's workers supporting each other across boundaries, culture, geography, whatever. When there's more and more struggle because that tends to make the working class more political and more radical. But before we get there, are there things that we can do? I don't have the answers, but I do know this. We better seriously think about it, because this is important. Maybe there's something to May Day 2020. May Day is International Workers' Day. Sometimes May Days are more important than other days, you know? Maybe it's not too early for Workers' World Party, for all the other groups, for all the young radicals, for everybody to start thinking, especially when more and more we're going to be pushed into, well, the election's the thing, the election's the thing, you know? How can we make May Day big and important for worldwide solidarity of the working class? I want to say a word about impeachment too. Impeachment worries me. First of all, the Democrats' program has nothing to do with the working class. It's about going after Trump because he talked on the phone with the president of the Ukraine. The workers are not interested in that. And if the Democratic politicians just sit up there like they've been doing for the past couple of weeks, and it's been on TV, it's almost ad nauseum, talking about, oh, we've got to defend democracy. This is a great democracy. We got to defend the Constitution. You know, I mean, the working class looks at them and scratches their head and says, I don't understand what you're doing has anything to do with democracy. All I know is that almost 1 million people are being cut off food stamps. What about that democracy?
Yeah.
You know? What about the children who are being put in cages in concentration camps? That's not democracy? What about the poisoned water in Flint and other places? That's democratic rights to us, not this other stuff. That's basically the Democratic Party trying to strengthen or save U.S. imperialism in relationship to Asia and everywhere else in the world. It's very dangerous. I think the more they do that, in a way, the more they embolden those elements in this country and the ruling class forces behind them that want to push things in a fascist direction. That's when fascism becomes a danger. Fascism becomes a danger when the ruling class realizes that because of conditions, there's the possibility that a class struggle may break out and they may lose ground and maybe lose it all. That's when they start toying with fascism. So onwards to fighting racism, to upholding the right of oppressed people to self-determination, to continuing in the example of what we did in 1974, and in so many ways, in so many places, the 45 years since that, and onwards to a new, more meaningful kind of working class internationalism. Thanks.